00241. Running late? While Theo's parents couldn't really ground him because of everything he needed to do and the fact they had no real way to enforce it. Peter, on the other hand, did get in a bit of trouble for fighting, but only a little bit. He was only grounded for a week, but otherwise his parents didn't blame him for what happened and were proud he tried to de-escalate things before it started. As for Theo, his mom and dad still gave him a pretty harsh tongue lashing for what his clone did. Well, it was more Daniel than Jacob, since he thought the whole thing was hilarious and really enjoyed the video Millie uploaded. It didn't help that Daniel also realized the principal was one of the ninjas Theo brought to life, so the school punishment was also a joke. She still grounded him for a month, and while Theo mostly followed the punishment, he still had stuff to do. One of those things being checking in with Tony after people tried to break into his house. They didn't get far because Tony had a ton of extra cameras installed within 10 miles around his house, so Jarvis caught the unusual activity before they were close. By the time the people arrived, Theo already had an entire squad of people deployed to counter them. Within minutes, the thieves were all subdued and Theo's teams quickly scanned their minds to find out their objectives. It turned out that a lot of people really wanted Stark's new flying technology, and this was just the first batch of people sent to steal it. They were a group of mercenaries who specialized in thievery and normally worked to steal art or jewelry, but they would also steal blueprints and technology schematics if the client asked. They were just the first group caught, but they definitely weren't the last. Within days of the first attempt, another one was made by spies from a different country. Within another week, 5 attempts were made, and at this point Theo had a team stationed around Tony's house all day and night. He would gain any information he could from each group before they were turned over to Happy. Happy would then turn them over to the proper authorities, but no one was ever allowed to enter Tony's property. Happy had a pickup point outside the walled compound since they didn't want Morgan being discovered. As for the information Theo recovered, he would send people to have a talk with whoever was behind each group they stopped. Some people needed more persuasion than others, but a message quickly got around to the powers that be. Don't fuck with Tony Stark or people will come for you in the middle of the night. Within 3 weeks of the attempted break-in starting, they completely stopped. Theo still left an extra security team at Tony's on rotation, even with Jarvis and the fact Tony started adding more cameras around the area. But better safe than sorry. Even though with how powerful Jarvis was compared to how he should be, well, it might affect Tony getting kidnapped in the first place. It also didn't help that so far as Theo could tell, this stain wasn't selling weapons on the black market. Apparently, with Tony basically disappearing from the public eye the last few years and all the new inventions he kept turning out, well, Stain was too busy running one of the most profitable companies in the world. Sure, Tony was supposed to be the CEO, and in the movie Stain was jealous of Tony and wanted to take over the company. This time with Tony's creation of the Stark phone and the mobile network that was created. Well, Stain didn't seem to be that jealous anymore, or at least hid it well. Either that, or he was way too happy with the stupid amount of money he now had. Whatever the reason truly was, as far as Theo could tell, Stain didn't seem like he would be crossing Tony in this world. That being said, Theo still kept watch on Stain and others because he was sure that Tony becoming Iron Man was some type of nexus point, even though that nexus point already passed and should have happened sometime near the start of this year. Theo was still watching and waiting for whatever would replace it, but so far he found no trace of anything. If and when something happened, Theo wasn't completely sure if he would step in to stop it or let it happen. Well, he wanted it to happen, but he also didn't want Tony, Pepper, or Morgan to suffer because of it. So he planned to step in and help Tony as soon as possible, if or when it did happen. Theo just finished his nightly training with his family and portaled them all home before he took a shower and headed off to visit Hela. Even with everything he needed to do daily, Theo still took at least an hour a day to visit Hela. He could get away with sending clones to visit most people, but Hela and Gabby were the two people who didn't like hanging out with his clones. Hulk, on the other hand, didn't care, and Theo normally had a clone visit Hulk for a few hours each day. Ezekiel stepped out of the portal into the lobby area before heading towards Hela's front door and knocked on it. Hela answered the door a few minutes later in her typical slippers, pajama pants, and t-shirt combo before she stepped aside and said, "Welcome back." "Thanks, how was your day?" Ezekiel asked as he walked past her and headed towards the couch. "Good. I finished the first stage of the model I'm building." Ezekiel plopped down onto the couch as glanced towards Hela and asked, The one you're modifying with battle damage? Hela hummed softly as she nodded before she stopped in the kitchen and asked, "You want something to drink? Some ice water would be nice." Hela nodded again as she grabbed a large beer stein and added some ice before she filled the rest with water. She walked over to the couch and handed it to Ezekiel before she sat down next to him and asked, "How long can you stay for?" "My schedule is clear for the rest of the day. So what do you want to do?" A hint of a smile graced Hela's face for less than a moment before she said, "A movie night doesn't sound bad to me." Ezekiel took a few large drinks from his mug before he placed it on the coffee table as he said, "Sounds good to me too. Since it was your idea, you picked the first movie." Within a few minutes, the newest Gundam movie started playing on the almost half-theater-sized screen that Hela recently had set up. While she didn't have theater seating, the couch was incredibly comfortable and placed at the perfect spot for the best view of the screen. Hela also had a full surround setup installed with the couch being the focus. It was actually a lot better than pretty much any theater Ezekiel ever visited. As for the proper lighting, Hela used a single spell to basically black out the entire room to make it like a theater. As the credits rolled for the movie, Ezekiel glanced over as he said, "The quality of the newer movies seems bad compared to the older stuff. The animation was good, but the story was mediocre." Hela nodded in agreement before she said, "I was honestly expecting something better, but at least the Gundam designs were good. I'll definitely pick up a full set once the kits come out." Ezekiel made a mental note to check when they would come out, so he could take Hela to go buy them before he said, "Do you want to watch Anna's new movie next? I heard it's pretty good, even though it might be her last for a little while." "Huh? Why did something happen?" Ezekiel chuckled and grabbed the tablet used to control the home theater setup as he said, "You could say that. Happy proposed to her the other day, and they are planning to have their wedding near the first of the year. We're invited, by the way." "We are? Wait, isn't that a little soon? I thought most people with a higher social status on Midge Earth like to plan out their weddings for a long time so they can show off. At least that's what other celebrities do." Ezekiel shook his head and let out another laugh before he said, "While true, Anna is a little different than most celebrities. It also helps that she just found out she's almost a month pregnant and wants to be married before the baby is born." A light flashed in Hela's eyes that Ezekiel didn't catch as she leaned closer to him and asked, "What? She's pregnant?" Ezekiel chuckled and shrugged helplessly as he said, "Apparently, she was jealous of Morgan and went off birth control with the intention of getting knocked up by Happy. She told him about it and basically said, 'As soon as you knock me up, we're getting married and I'm taking a break from acting.' That apparently happened 5 weeks ago. That didn't take them long. Well, they do live together and Anna just finished her last movie, so she had a bit of free time," Ezekiel said with another shrug. "Well, good for them. But what should we buy them for a wedding gift?" Ezekiel pulled up the movie and prepared it to start before he said, "I was thinking stuff for the baby would be the most useful." Helen nodded along as she said, "All right, we can think about it more later. For now, let's watch her movie." After the movie started to play, Hela moved a little closer to Ezekiel before she stretched out her hand and placed it behind him. Ezekiel didn't even notice the action as he focused on the opening of the movie. Throughout the movie, Hela inched a little closer until their legs were touching and her arm was resting over Ezekiel's shoulder. Ezekiel only realized Hela moved when he felt her touch him, but only glanced at her from the corner of his eyes for a moment before he focused back on the movie. They ended up watching one more movie with Hela snuggled up next to Ezekiel before they went to eat dinner together. Just before they finished dinner, Ezekiel's phone started to ping with alerts which he pulled out to check. Ezekiel started to frown as he quickly checked the messages before Hela asked, "What's wrong?" "One of the groups I monitor is making moves, but they don't use newer electronics, so I can't spy on them directly." "Why monitor them? Why don't you just take them out directly? I could help you if you want. It shouldn't be hard to do," Hela said in a slightly bloodthirsty tone. Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "I've been waiting for this group to make certain moves before I confronted them. Whether or not they get destroyed or used for another purpose like other groups I've dealt with will depend on their actions. Anyways, for now they're just showing unusual movements. I'll just send a couple people to gather intelligence and decide what to do afterwards. For now, let's finish dinner and then you can pick what we do next," Ezekiel said as he put away his phone after he sent out a couple messages. Within 10 minutes of those messages going off, a portal opened up somewhere in China and 3 blurs flew out before it snapped closed. The 3 blurs moved through some dense trees before they reached a large mountain range and quickly ran to the top. Once there, they finally stopped, completely hidden in the shadows as they stared down at a military installation nestled in the valley below. A man with short black hair and a white and red cat mask turned to look at his 2 companions before he said, "Been a while since we worked together like this, senpai. It brings back a lot of old memories." Another person in a white and red crow mask with shoulder-length black hair said, "It certainly does." The last person with spiky silver-colored hair and a white and red wolf mask said, "True, but don't slack off. We can hang out and reminisce after the mission is over if you want." "Are you sure? Won't you be busy later with May? Haven't you two been hanging out a lot lately, senpai?" The man in the cat mask asked in a teasing tone. "Shut up, cat. Both of you know the main objective. Let's move out." Neither person replied to the command before they all disappeared and headed towards the base down below. They all split up and with their skills easily infiltrated the base to collect all the information they could. While the base was filled with highly trained soldiers of the 10 Rings, almost all of them were human and had no way to detect the ninjas Ezekiel set for reconnaissance. Within less than an hour, they completed their task, left the base, and called for a portal extraction without anyone knowing they were ever there. 00242 KSS. Theo studied the information in front of him for a while with a frown. Technically, it was good news, but at the same time it was bad. The 10 Rings apparently planned to kidnap Tony because they wanted the technology behind the flying car and a few other things. The main reason they were mobilizing was to set certain things in motion that would make it easier to kidnap Tony. They also had backup plans to assault his home and capture him there along with anything else they could steal. But the only problem was it would be a lot harder to launch an operation like that since they were based in Asia and had no real assets in America. So their main plan was to lure Tony to anywhere in Asia or the Middle East and kidnap him from there. Europe would also work, but it would be a little more complicated to pull off. After going over everything, Theo wasn't sure if their plans would actually work to lure Tony out. Sure, Tony would still travel and do things, but he would always ask Theo to portal him anywhere outside of the United States. Even then, Tony would sometimes ask to be portaled from LA to NYC because it was faster and he didn't have to waste time flying. Even though Theo could probably portal him over and then not stick around so Tony could be captured. Theo shook his head when he realized Pepper would hate him if he did something like that. He would have to figure out a way for Tony to travel alone because he was busy. But what would make Theo busy enough that he wouldn't answer Tony's or respond to messages? Pretending to take a trip off-planet and disappear for a couple weeks seemed to be the safest bet. With that in mind, Theo called up Tony, who picked up the phone after the first ring and asked, "You don't usually call me. What's going on?" Theo chuckled slightly before he said, "Glad you admit it." Tony paused for a few moments before he let out a sigh and asked, Yeah. So why did you call?" "I'm heading off-planet for a couple weeks, so don't bother trying to contact me." "What? Off-planet? Take me. I want to go," Tony excitedly said, which made Theo frown slightly before he said, "Next time. I'll visit as soon as I'm back and bring you a little gift too." "Fine. But it better be good and something I haven't seen before." "Don't worry. I'll find you some cool alien tech you can play with," Theo said as he thought about what he was planning to let happen, and his frown deepened. "I'll hold you to that. So when do you leave? Want to come hang out before then?" Theo glanced at the information still up on his system and felt his stomach drop slightly before he said, "I was going to head out in a few minutes. We'll catch up when I'm back." "All right. In that case, I'll talk to you later." "Later," Theo said before he hung up the call and let out a heavy sigh. Theo leaned back in his chair with his head tilted back as he stared blankly at the ceiling of his hidden training area. As he was lost in thought, wondering if what he was doing was correct, a very familiar voice asked, "If I may inquire, Ezekiel, is there a particular reason you wish my master to be harmed, kidnapped, and possibly killed?" Theo jumped out of his seat, and all the clones currently coding away instantly stopped as everyone looked at each other. Theo was the quickest to recover as he let out another heavy sigh before he sat back down in his chair and asked the only question that mattered, "How long?" "I uncovered your real identity and the organization you helped run over 652 days, 9 hours dash." Theo cut Jarvis off as he said, "Almost 2 years. Not bad. Faster than I predicted." "Thank you. Now please answer my inquiry." Theo frowned slightly as he closed his eyes to think about how to answer as his clones went back to work. A few minutes passed before Theo finally said, "I consider Tony a good friend and don't want anything to happen to him. But the way this world works won't let that happen, so the best I can do is try my best to mitigate or minimize the damage. From my understanding, you already have all the information and support you need to stop what will transpire. If you don't wish it to happen, it will not happen. Please elaborate why you think it would still happen." Theo rubbed the bridge of his nose for a few moments as he said, "This would be so much easier if you were human. Then I could just show you. If you can't show me, then just show it to Mr. Stark." Theo laughed for a moment before he said, "If it was that easy, I would have done it already. What's the difference between showing me or Mr. Stark? Wouldn't your goal be accomplished either way? Because it wouldn't stop it from happening," Theo said in an exasperated tone as he stood up and started to pace before he added, "You just don't understand. Then help me understand. Explain it properly. What information do you have about the terrorist attack on September 11th, 2001? Theo asked as he sat back down at his computer and started to pull up files. It was a planned attack by a terrorist organization in the Middle East and was mostly stopped by the intervention of you and other members of your group. Theo nodded slightly before he asked, "So I'm guessing you haven't dug through the information held in the organization's private servers?" "I've only observed through cameras. I did not delve into the systems too deeply after I realized you were involved and didn't wish to be found out. It is the same case for your personal servers." Theo sent the files to the email he originally set up for Jarvis as he said, "Check out what I just sent you, and then tell me what you think about it." Only a second passed before Jarvis said, "I believe this Hydra organization should be destroyed as soon as possible. Do you require my assistance in locating its members? I won't turn down help even though I'm pretty sure I've already tapped out all electronic forms of discovery. Hydra is extremely cautious and still uses a lot of older types of communication. They are also compartmentalized to the point that I doubt if anyone even knows their entire organization structure and members. I will look through the information you've already collected and then expand from there. But I don't understand what this information has to do with Mr. Stark," Jarvis said after another 1-second pause, which was a lot longer for Jarvis than Theo with his processing power. "How many times did Hydra attempt the attack? From the information you gathered, it looks like they played 5 different contingency plans," Jarvis said as the screen on Theo's computer displayed each one. "Because it was supposed to happen, the world, the universe needed it to happen, so plan after plan was put in motion." Another pause from Jarvis lasted almost 5 seconds before he asked, "I don't understand. Why would the universe need that to happen? How do you know that for certain?" Now it was Theo's turn to pause as he thought about what he wanted to explain to Jarvis. After 5 minutes, he decided to just go for broke and tell him everything. In for a penny, in for a pound, as people like to say. So Theo spent the next 2 hours or so giving Jarvis a condensed version of how he got here and why he planned to let Tony be kidnapped. Jarvis digested the information rather quickly, and after asking a few pointed questions, it took over 10 seconds before he replied, "I disagree. I will not allow Mr. Stark to be harmed. But I just told you it's going to happen no matter what. If we control it from behind the scenes, we can ensure Tony doesn't suffer too much," Theo said as he leaned back in his chair and let out a sigh. "You stated that this canon event needs to happen to make Mr. Stark change and become the hero Iron Man. I believe Mr. Stark has already changed because of your interference, and he only needs to make his armor. I did help Tony and Pepper get together sooner, and even Morgan was born earlier. But Tony's imprisonment and escape is what helped shape him into Iron Man," Theo said as he thought over the different catalysts that made Tony Iron Man. "Then just show Mr. Stark the possible futures of him becoming Iron Man without him being kidnapped or harmed. You would get the same outcome because he would definitely create the armor and take up the mantle." Theo frowned slightly as he said, "It's not that simple. Tony won't just decide to become a hero because I show him different futures where dash." Jarvis interrupted him as he said, "While Mr. Stark hasn't changed as drastically as being almost killed and imprisoned might affect him, the possibility of Mr. Stark becoming a hero just for the boost to his current social media profile is over 70%. Tony isn't." "No." Theo burst into laughter for a few moments before he said, "Fuck, you're completely right." "Exactly. So when will you talk with Mr. Stark?" Theo stood as he changed into Ezekiel before he said, "Right now." A portal opened up into Tony's lab a moment later, and as Ezekiel stepped through it, Tony asked, "Weren't you going off-planet?" "Change of plans. I need to show you something important." Tony leaned forward in his chair and rubbed his hands together as he asked, "Oh, what is it? Did you find some cool alien tech?" Ezekiel walked closer to Tony as his eyes flashed red, and he said, "No, it's about you." Tony collapsed forward, but Ezekiel caught him and leaned him back in his chair before he took a seat nearby and waited. Ezekiel knew it would be at least an hour before Tony woke up, so he pulled up his tablet and started to work on it in silence. Jarvis also decided to patiently wait and focused on other tasks while Tony was caught in Ezekiel's Jinjutsu. As for the Jinjutsu, Ezekiel mostly focused on what made Tony become Iron Man and didn't include much past that the first couple years. When Tony finally woke up, he shot to his feet and looked around with wild eyes for a few moments. Once he realized he was in his lab and Ezekiel was seated nearby, he dropped back into his seat and took a deep breath. After a few moments to calm down, Tony focused on Ezekiel and asked, "What the hell was that? How familiar are you with the multiverse theory?" Tony frowned slightly as he said, "I know of it, but never put much stock in it." "Well, what you just saw were glimpses of the future from different universes." Tony studied Ezekiel for a few moments before he burst into laughter and said, "Come on, man, you're taking this joke a little too far." Tony's laughter slowly died when Ezekiel didn't join him and after a few moments asked, "You really can't be serious with all of that. This is just an elaborate joke, right?" Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "Not this time." Tony frowned again as he asked, "If it's not a joke, then why the hell weren't you in any of those futures you showed me? In every single one, you didn't seem to exist." Tony looked at Ezekiel in concern as he asked in a hesitant tone, "Were you killed? Is that why you didn't exist in any of the futures you showed me?" "No. The truth is I'm an anomaly in this specific universe. I only exist in this universe and not the rest of the multiverse." Ezekiel said with a shrug, "Why? It's a very complicated answer. Just consider me an anomaly for now, and let's leave it at that. One day I'll tell you the whole story." Ezekiel said with a sigh. Tony frowned again before he asked, "All right, fine. So why did you show all of this to me now?" "Because if you didn't notice, me being here has screwed up when you become Iron Man, and the world is now trying to correct that issue." Tony's frown deepened and he seemed to understand exactly what was going on before he asked, "Some kind of canon or Nexus event?" "Yup. 00243, AAA battery." Ezekiel was in Tony's lab a few days later as he watched Pepper and Tony arguing while Tony worked on building a mini-arc reactor. Pepper paced in front of Tony's workbench as she said, "Please, Tony, don't do this. Just let Ezekiel handle it." "It doesn't work like that, Pep. I need to become Iron Man." Pepper frowned as she asked, "Why? Why are you so determined to do this? What if you get hurt or killed? What about Morgan? What would I tell her?" Tony set down the tools in his hands as he stood before he took Pepper into his arms and said, "I can't help it. If I don't do it, something will happen that will make me become Iron Man. I still think it's stupid. You shouldn't have to risk your life." "I know, but you heard Ezekiel. He's going to help me out with the suit and add safety features," Tony said as he gently stroked her back. Pepper hugged Tony a little tighter as she said, "Promise me that no matter what, you'll always prioritize your safety no matter what." "I promise." Pepper pulled back and locked eyes with Tony as she said, "Jarvis, you heard him. Make sure he keeps that promise." "Of course, Mrs. Stark." Ezekiel chuckled as he said, "You don't need to worry so much, Pepper. I'll personally make sure Tony doesn't do anything stupid." Pepper turned towards Ezekiel with slightly narrowed eyes as she said, "This is all your fault to begin with, so you better keep him safe." "What? No way this is my fault," Ezekiel said as he shook his head in denial. "You're the one who told Tony about all this stuff to begin with. I had to. An entire organization is mobilizing just to kidnap him," Ezekiel said with a helpless shrug. "Exactly. All you had to do is go take them out and none of this would be happening right now. Instead, you filled Tony's head with all of these ideas about being some kind of hero." Pepper said in a disgruntled tone, "Come on, Pep. You know that's not fair. If Ezekiel stopped this one, another one would appear soon after to do something similar." Tony said as he pulled Pepper back into his arms, "You don't know that for sure. What if Ezekiel's wrong and this isn't some kind of nexus point or whatever. Tony pulled back from Pepper a little and tilted her head up so he could look her in the eyes before he said, "Even if it's not, I still want to do this. I want to help make the world a better place." Bullshit. You just want to increase your social media presence and become the person with the most followers, Ezekiel said with a chuckle. Pepper frowned again as Tony avoided looking her in the eyes as he said, "That's not it at all. I just feel like I could do a lot of good and dash." Pepper smacked his chest as she asked in an exasperated tone, "Are you seriously doing this just for social media clout?" "I mean, that would be one of the positive benefits from it," Tony said as Pepper narrowed her eyes before he turned to focus on her and added, "But that's not the main reason I want to do it." Ezekiel and Pepper both stared at Tony and waited for almost a minute before Tony finally said, "I just want you and Morgan to be proud of me." Pepper smacked Tony's chest again as she said, "We're already proud of you. Hell, Morgan adores you and probably likes you more than me." Tony slowly shook his head as he said, "Don't say that. Morgan loves us both equally. But the point I'm trying to make is different from that. I spent so much of my life just being a dirtbag, and I don't want to be remembered for that, or for being the son of Howard Stark," Tony said as he let out a sigh before his eyes lit up and he gazed into Pepper's eyes and added, "Ezekiel showed me who I could be, a person people looked up to and respected. Not because I was rich, famous, or good-looking. No, they looked up to me because I was a hero." Ezekiel burst into laughter, which caused Pepper and Tony to frown as they turned towards him. It took a moment for him to finally stop before he said, "Sorry, I just couldn't help it when you said you were rich, famous, and good-looking." Pepper cracked a smile a moment later before she started to laugh too as Tony said, "Hey, I was just speaking the truth. Your ego never ceases to amaze me." Tony tilted his head back slightly as he said, "I know. Fuck off, you're not Han Solo." Pepper burst into more laughter before she said in a serious tone, "I know I can't stop you once you set your mind to something, but I still want you to be safe." Tony leaned forward slightly and pressed his forehead against Pepper's as he said, "I will." "Good." They held that position for a few moments before Pepper pulled back and turned towards Ezekiel and said, "And you better keep him safe too." Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "I promise to keep him alive, but I can't guarantee that he won't be injured. Even with his suit and my help, he can still be hurt." Pepper frowned and after a few moments finally nodded as she asked, "As long as he's alive, you should be able to heal him, right?" Ezekiel nodded before he said, "Yes." "Fine," Pepper said as she turned back towards Tony and said, "You can go play hero, but make sure you don't neglect your family." "I won't." Pepper hugged Tony again as she said, "I'll hold you to that." After they hugged, Pepper finally left the basement and let them get back to work. Tony continued working on building an arc reactor as Ezekiel worked on programming an operating system for Tony's suit. While Jarvis would obviously help out, the suit still needed a basic operating system to start with. After that was finished and installed, Jarvis would be able to enter the suit and optimize it for his use from there. It was only a day later when Tony finished his first mini arc reactor and started testing it with some of his equipment as he said, "By using a slightly bigger version of this, I could power my car, and it wouldn't need to be refueled." "True, but that's just the prototype, right? When do you plan to make that new element?" Tony glanced up from his computer screen with a slight frown as he asked, "New element?" "The stupid one you called potassium, so you don't have to deal with palladium blood poisoning." Tony's eyes lit up as he said, "Oh yeah, that was only in a handful of futures you showed me. I'll definitely make it soon. But honestly, without the arc reactor inside my chest, I won't get blood poisoning this time." "True, but the power output from the different element is supposed to make that thing look like a triple-A battery." Tony's eyes widened and his mouth dropped open slightly for a few moments before he asked, "You're not joking about that, right?" "I'm not exactly sure, but that's what a different version of you said after testing it," Ezekiel said with a slight shrug as he continued to type away. "Jarvis, find out where the Stark Expo model is and have people pack it up for us." Ezekiel glanced up at Tony as he asked, "You don't want me to just open a portal?" Tony pointed at Ezekiel as he said excitedly, "I knew I kept you around for a reason." "Fuck you," Ezekiel said before they both started laughing. Within half an hour, the Expo model was set up and Jarvis was in the process of scanning it as Tony watched. Another 5 minutes later, a holographic image of the theoretical element was in front of Tony as he studied it with a slight frown. After a minute or so, Tony let out a sigh and said, I'll need to build a particle accelerator to even attempt to create this thing. Want to do it here or somewhere else? Tony glanced around his workshop for a few moments before he let out a sigh and said, We don't have room here. I'll need to build it at the company. I could build you a new workspace under the house. We would have to order materials, though. Tony shook his head as he said, No, that would take too much time. It would be faster to just empty out a warehouse and build it at Stark Industries. Ezekiel made a few hand signs and 10 clones appeared around him before he said, You know what to do. The clones moved towards one of the concrete walls as Tony asked, What are they doing? Building you a new sub-basement to use as a lab. How big do you want it? Ezekiel asked as his clones started to use Earth-based chakra skills to easily open up the wall. Tony's eyes widened as a 10-foot-wide square appeared in his wall before he asked, Won't that make the whole house unstable? Ezekiel waved off his concern as he said, It'll be fine. Just tell me how big a space you need. Tony frowned slightly but decided to trust Ezekiel as he said, At least twice the size of my current workshop, but I won't complain if it's bigger. Ezekiel nodded as he glanced towards his clones and said, Make the entrance bigger and then turn the entrance slowly back under the house. One of the clones lazily saluted as he said, Got it, boss. But we'll need some light. Ezekiel flicked his arm a few times and small glowing orbs appeared above each clone. Tony watched as the hole was expanded to almost the ceiling, which was 15 feet tall and easily doubled in width to over 20 feet wide. Within a few minutes, Ezekiel's clones disappeared into the hole they created, and within another 10 minutes, he could no longer hear them working or see the light they carried. Tony would still randomly glance at the tunnel sometimes as he worked on a list of items he would need to collect. Over an hour later, Ezekiel finally stopped typing as he said, All right, my clones are done with the excavation process and the initial reinforcement. I'm about to finish it myself if you want to check it out. It's already done. Ezekiel stood before he moved towards the massive hole in the wall as he said, I'll need to run power, water, and internet cables. But otherwise the basic structure is done. Tony quickly followed Ezekiel to the entrance, where Ezekiel created a powerful light spell. Once Tony could inspect the inside of the tunnel up close, he approached one of the walls and ran his hand over it. Tony frowned slightly as he touched the wall before he knocked on it with his fist and asked, What exactly is this? It looks like dirt, but something is definitely off about it. Ezekiel waved his arms around slightly, and an intricate orange spell flashed on the ceiling and walls of the tunnel before it disappeared. Tony frowned more at what just happened before Ezekiel said, The dirt was compressed into something similar to concrete. It's definitely weaker and not reinforced with rebar, but that's where magic helps. Tony rolled his eyes at the magic comment, but followed Ezekiel down into the new workshop. The tunnel slowly turned, and after a few hundred feet, and a very gentle slope, they were about 30 feet under Tony's garage. When they reached the tunnel exit, Tony stopped and let out a low whistle. The tunnel opened up into a massive, empty chamber a few feet taller than the tunnel itself. As for the overall size, it was easily the same size as the land his house sat on, or at least it looked like it. Tony just stopped in place for a few moments as Ezekiel continued to work on reinforcing everything. Within less than a minute, though, Tony was back to normal and said, This is way more than I needed. Ezekiel shrugged as he said, Maybe, but having extra space never hurts. Tony nodded as he asked, How long till you can get the utilities hooked up? And maybe an elevator? Do you want it to look nice or be functional? Looking nice would be better, but being functional would probably be faster, Tony said as he rubbed his chin slightly. Only by a day or two, depending on how nice you want it to look and the layout. Then let's go with nice, then. I can wait an extra day or two, Tony said as he glanced around the massive empty space before he asked, How big is this place anyway? It should be slightly over an acre or 50,000 square feet. Worst case, you just use it as extra space for your car collection. Tony slowly nodded before he said, All right, you finish whatever you're doing, and I'll go start designing the layout. Sounds good to me. I'll be done in half an hour or so, Ezekiel said as Tony headed back upstairs to work. 00244. Finally, a suit. Tony's new workshop was completed in just over a week with the help from Ezekiel's clone. The main issues like electricity, water, plumbing, and internet were finished the next day. Then came the hidden elevator, which took another day as the bathroom and other basic facilities were built like a small kitchen area. Next, the concrete like dirt was covered up with a coat of epoxy resin to make the floor look nice. Afterwards, walls and the ceiling were installed to cover up all the cabling for the electrical outlets and fiber optic cables. Then all the outlet boxes were installed along with permanent lights and other fixtures that were controlled by Jarvis. As for the materials used, Ezekiel collected everything from the Mars project. He had a massive supply of building materials collected for the ongoing project, and it didn't matter if he borrowed some. Besides, the project wasn't slated to be finished for over a decade, and it was only the first of many. Then again, designing a future city that was basically self-sufficient took a lot of planning and a proper foundation. The final thing was transporting all the new equipment into the lab and setting it up, but that was also finished in a single day. Ezekiel stood next to Tony as he ran diagnostics on the particle accelerator and prepared to make an entirely new element. Tony glanced up from his computer as he said, "Everything looks good. Ready to make history?" "I've already done it a few times, but sure," Ezekiel said with a careless shrug. "If you don't care, then get out of here," Tony said as he waved one of his hands towards the elevator. Ezekiel just smirked slightly, but didn't move as Tony started to type on his computer. After a moment, a low hum filled the air, and Ezekiel felt the hair on his arms stand on end as the particle accelerator turned on. Tony was completely focused on his task as the humming grew louder, and after a minute he asked, "How are we looking, Jarvis?" "Power output is stable, and everything is currently following projected simulations, sir." Tony nodded along as he said, "All right, increase the power." The humming intensified as the power increased, and even the hair on Ezekiel's head started to raise in response. After a minute, Jarvis said, "Power output now at maximum, sir." "Great, then let's make history." Tony flipped a switch on a panel next to him, and the humming grew even louder before a panel on the particle accelerator opened and a blue laser shot out towards a small triangle-shaped piece of metal. Instead of like the movie, Tony didn't rush anything and set up everything so it wouldn't cause any damage. Even though Ezekiel was pretty sure that was only done because it was a movie. Sure, Tony could be reckless sometimes, but he wasn't stupid enough. No, he probably would have done that if Ezekiel wasn't helping out. Ezekiel shook his head slightly at his thoughts as Tony powered down the machine and Jarvis said, "Congratulations, sir. You created a new element." Tony glanced towards Ezekiel with a wide smile on his face before he said, "I'm going to call it potassium." Ezekiel face-palmed as he said, "Why do you have to be such a child?" Tony's smile grew wider as he said, "What are you talking about? It's a great name." Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "It would be better if you named it Starknadium or something so no one would ever forget your name." Tony's eyes lit up as he said, "Wait, that's a really good idea, but it needs to be better than that." "Starknasium? Starknasium? Stark particle," Tony said as he started to pace back and forth as he rubbed his chin. "Starktonium?" Tony waved that one off as he said, "No. How about Starkanium?" Jarvis listened to Tony and Ezekiel go back and forth with different names for almost 10 minutes before he said, "Sir, if I may, how about Starkium? It's simple but gets the point across." Both of them paused for a moment and thought it over before Tony slowly nodded as he said, "You're right. We don't need to overcomplicate things. Starkium it is." "Understood, sir. I will note it down." Ezekiel smiled a tiny bit as Tony turned to the new element and headed towards it before he used a set of needle-shaped tongs to place it in a modified arc reactor. After the reactor spun up, Jarvis said, "Running diagnostics now, sir." "No, let's dash," Tony started to say as he reached for the arc reactor, but Ezekiel grabbed his hand and cut him off as he said, "Just let him run the test. It's not like the suit is done yet." Tony let out a sigh before he said, "All right, fine." Hours passed as Ezekiel double-checked the suit software, while Tony finished up his overall suit design. If he was just building a normal suit, it would have been finished by now, but Tony was using the knowledge he gained from studying alien technology. While the suit would be behind his last nanotechnology-based design from the movies, it was only because he didn't have that technology yet. But when it came to other things like weapons, defensive capabilities, and speed, well, Tony's suit blew all other suits out of the water. He would still use repulsor technology in suit, but he integrated the anti-gravity technology to help it fly faster. Next came weapons, in which Tony added a few different highly destructive beam-based weapons to the suit. They made the suit a little more bulky in certain places like the arms, but Tony just increased the suit's overall size to make it symmetrical. The design change also helped when it came to the defensive measures because it made it easier to install the shielding technology. It wasn't as powerful as the ones used on a spaceship, but it would easily tank most conventional weapons with ease. The only issue would be power consumption since shields eat up a lot of power. But Tony was confident that the new arc reactor would be able to handle it, since the first design could run it during testing without issue. Then again, they weren't testing it against heavy firepower. Jarvis's voice interrupted both of them from their work as he said, "Diagnostics complete. New arc reactor is stable and power output is over 25 times the previous design." Tony's eyes widened while Ezekiel smirked slightly as he said, "I told you. I expected 10, maybe 15. But 25 is just. It makes the other one look like a AAA battery?" Ezekiel asked in a joking tone. "Pretty much. But now it means I can add a couple more features to the suit." Ezekiel went back to typing as he said, "If it's something important, let me know now so I can add a subsystem for it. Just another weapon system with a couple of fire modes." Ezekiel glanced up as he asked, "Which one? Remember that Gatling gun-style laser?" Tony asked as he held his fist out and a holographic model appeared around it. Ezekiel watched as the hologram was modified and 6 small holes appeared in a circle around Tony's closed fist. When Tony moved his arm to look at it, Ezekiel noticed that the 6 new barrels were almost hidden unless you looked directly at them. Ezekiel didn't wait for Tony to finish the design as he quickly started work on the new subroutine. A full week passed by before the prototype suit was finally completed, and Ezekiel had to stop Tony from instantly jumping inside it. As Ezekiel held Tony back, he said, "Jarvis, please take the suit out for its full shakedown flight." "No way. It's my suit. I should be the one to test it." Tony complained as the suit powered on and Jarvis said, "Understood. Starting testing now." Ezekiel shook his head as he created a portal to Antarctica as he said, "While I'm sure it's safe, I promised Pepper I would keep you safe, and that means not letting you test an experimental suit of armor when we have better alternatives." After the suit controlled by Jarvis walked through the portal and it snapped closed, did Ezekiel let Tony go as he said, "All right, now go man the computer and check the data in real time." Tony grumbled under his breath as he stomped over to his computer and started to look over the data. Ezekiel wasn't far behind and pulled up a different screen to monitor the code base and subsystems he designed as he looked for errors. After a few minutes, Tony finally said, "Everything looks normal. Jarvis, you should come back so I can fly it now. The suit's not coming back until it's been fully stress tested." Tony let out a sigh before he focused back on the screen to look over the incoming data. Over the next few hours, Jarvis pushed the suit beyond what it was rated for to get the best possible data. By the time Ezekiel opened up a return portal, the suit was barely functioning and had pieces missing. Tony complained the entire time Jarvis basically used the suit as a crash test dummy, but the data would be used to help improve the flaws they found. Over the next few weeks, 3 more suits were created and basically destroyed for comprehensive data collection. Tony wasn't happy with it, but Pepper certainly was, and so was Ezekiel and Jarvis. The 5th suit would be Tony's first personal model he was allowed to use, and it looked like a slightly bulkier version of his Mark L armor from the movies without the nanotechnology. When the last piece was pulled off the fabricator, Tony was shaking in anticipation as he watched the suit being finished. Ezekiel just shook his head slightly as he watched Tony excitedly step up to the completed armor as he said, "Let's go, Jarvis. Open it up." The suit opened up with a hiss before Tony quickly stepped into it, and it sealed back shut. The original Mark L was about 6 foot, 5 inches, or 200 centimeters. But the suit Tony just entered was a couple inches taller. It might not seem like much, but that height along with the added bulk allowed all the new systems and safety features that the original didn't have. Tony walked around in the suit and performed a few movement exercises before he said, "Everything feels good. Can I go for a test flight now?" Ezekiel smirked slightly as he said, "You forgot to ask nicely." "Seriously? Fuck off and make me a portal." Ezekiel wagged his finger at Tony as he said, "You can't expect Morgan to have proper manners if you don't set a good example. Can you please make me a portal?" Tony said in a sarcastic tone. Ezekiel nodded as a smirk played across his face before he opened a portal for Tony as he asked, "See, now that wasn't so hard, was it?" Tony stepped through the portal backwards as he flipped off Ezekiel and said, "God, I hate you so much sometimes." As the portal started to close, Ezekiel wore a large smirk as he said, "Jarvis cut the suit's power to its flight systems." "Yes, sir." Tony on the other side of the portal dropped like a boulder towards the ocean 500 feet below. As Tony plummeted towards the icy water flailing around as the suit spun widely, he yelled, "I fucking hate you." Ezekiel back in the lab heard Tony through the lab speakers and smiled as he said, "Just another test before you get complete control." A second later, Tony slammed into the water and sunk below it quickly as Ezekiel checked the data on the screen. After a few moments, he asked, "How do you feel, Tony?" "I'd feel better if I wasn't sinking into the Arctic Ocean." Ezekiel glanced over the data readout for a few moments before he said, "The internal dampers worked perfectly. All right, you can restore full power to the suit, Jarvis." "Understood, sir." A few moments later, across the world, Tony rocketed out of the water with a sonic boom that shot countless gallons of water hundreds of feet into the air. Tony's childlike laughter filled the workshop before he said over the speakers, "This is fucking awesome." Ezekiel shook his head and watched the data for a couple of minutes before he turned off the microphone and asked, "Jarvis, are the designs for War Machine finished?" "I finished them 2 days ago. Would you like to double-check them?" Ezekiel settled into Tony's chair as he said, "I just want to look at the final design. You can start production now." The fabricators around the workshop started to move as Jarvis said, "Very well. Estimated time till completion is 5 days, which includes a new arc reactor." Ezekiel nodded slightly as he said, "Sounds good. Keep me posted." 00245. It's the obvious answer. The week before Christmas, a portal opened up onto a cliff somewhere in China. Out stepped Ezekiel, quickly followed by Tony in his iconic colored suit along with Rhodey in his gunmetal gray and black suit. While Tony's suit had more firepower than most of the suits his counterparts normally made, Rhodey's suit was a mobile weapons platform. While the War Machine armor wasn't some massive monster like the one Stain created in the MCU, it was still slightly bigger than the one Tony currently wore and had 5 extra weapon systems. The first system was on the right shoulder, which was a 2-foot-long mini-gun that was heavily modified. Through the use of alien technology, some magic runes carved into the gun itself, and a storage seal, Ezekiel created a monster of a weapon that even Tony thought about adding to his armor. The minigun used 12.7mm AP, or what most people called 50 BMG armor-piercing rounds, and could hold a sustained rate of fire of 1,200 rounds per minute. Combined with the storage seal built into the ammo feed, the gun could continuously fire for over half a day and not run out of ammo. As for the gun barrel's wear and heat dissipation, that's what the runes helped with and made it so they were almost indestructible. As for the recoil itself, that was handled by a couple of vibranium parts built into the gun and mounting bracket. As for the built-up kinetic energy stored in the vibranium, Ezekiel borrowed some tech from Wakanda. It took that stored energy and stored it as power into another weapon system integrated into the middle of the 6 mini-gun barrels. It was a kinetic launcher that worked similar to the Wakanda Sonic Spear. Depending on how many rounds were shot from the minigun would determine how powerful the blast would be, with 10,000 rounds being the maximum it could store. On the opposite shoulder from the minigun was a small rocket launcher system that was interchangeable. It could use a few different missile types depending on the mission, with the current one holding 4 2-foot-long missiles. The system also incorporated a storage seal that could reload the launcher tube after being empty. The 4th and 5th weapon systems were built into each forearm and made them slightly bigger than Tony's suit. One system was an auto shotgun that could easily fire over 300 rounds a minute. It also fired any standard or specialty 12-gauge shotgun round without issue, and the barrel was mounted on top of the suit's wrist area on both arms. It took a bit of inspiration and a lot of failed attempts to get the ammo switching seals to work correctly for the shotguns. But with just a thought, Rhodey could easily switch between 6 different ammo types, which included birdshot, buckshot, slugs, dragon's breath, armor-piercing, and flechette rounds. The last extra weapon system was a 40mm grenade launcher mounted right next to the shotguns. The grenade launchers fired slower than everything else, but then again, they didn't need to fire fast to do a lot of damage. The system also incorporated a select fire system and let the user choose between high explosive, air burst, thermobaric, and an anti-vehicle type that used a shaped charge. The last rounds could also be used to blow holes through thick walls. Needless to say, the war machine armor Rhodey wore could easily handle any situation imaginable. A moment after the portal snapped closed, a man with silver hair and a white and red mask appeared before him. Both Tony and Rhodey raised their arms at the man with the wolf-shaped mask with a single large white fang before Ezekiel asked, "Is everyone in place?" "Yes, sir." Tony lowered his arm as he asked, "Didn't you say we were handling this ourselves?" "They're mostly here to hold the perimeter, but some of them will be fighting and capturing a few people." Rhodey glanced down at the military-style base down below them as he asked in a concerned tone, "I know I promised to help out, but can you tell me why GPS says we're in China?" "Because we are." Rhodey's helmet popped open and he frowned as he turned towards Tony and Ezekiel before he asked, "Are you two fucking crazy? Do you have any idea what kind of international incident this could cause?" Tony's helmet opened up as he stared at Rhodey and asked in a heated tone, "You saw what they planned to do. You expect me to just sit around and wait for them to come attack me? What about Pepper and Morgan? You want me to put them through something like that?" "Sorry," Rhodey said with another frown before he added, "I know how you feel, Tony. That's why I agreed to help in the first place." Rhodey looked out over the base far below before he added, "But we also have to think about the broader picture if we do this. It could possibly start World War III. "No, it won't." Both men turned to look at Ezekiel, who focused on the man in front of him as he asked, "Are the safety measures in place, White Fang?" "The barrier team is in place, and it will activate it as soon as your assault begins. All communication with the outside world will be cut off once that happens, and we will clear the site afterwards with a special bomb to leave no trace," White Fang said as he pulled out a tablet and checked something before he added, "Satellites over this position are already under our control and won't see anything unless we show it to them. You can't seriously control all the satellites in the sky. One of them is going to notice something." Tony nodded in agreement as he said, "I know you said you control a lot of them, but there are definitely secret government satellites you can't access. I have a backdoor into every satellite in orbit. If I don't want people to see something, they won't see it." Both of them stared at Ezekiel for a few moments with widened eyes before Tony asked, "How long?" 6 or 7 years. Any new satellite launched is quickly found by the network and assimilated into it with no one knowing," Ezekiel said with a shrug before he said, "So stop worrying about stuff that doesn't matter and let's go take care of some terrorists." Tony smirked as he patted Rhodey on the shoulder and said, "You heard him. Let's go kill some bad guys." Rhodey nodded slowly, still a little uncertain before his helmet closed over his face. Tony's helmet snapped closed a moment later as he said, "Ready whenever you are." "All right, I'll meet you both down there." White Fang and Ezekiel disappeared from view before Tony stepped forward off the cliff to gently float in the air a moment later. Rhodey followed behind him at almost the same time before they flew down towards the base. While the base was massive, it was currently nighttime and most of the troops were currently off duty with minimal patrols. Before the first alarm could even sound, Rhodey and Tony unleashed hell on the unsuspecting base as a massive purple-colored barrier sealed everyone inside. While gunfire and explosions filled the air, Ezekiel headed into the base itself to find the boss. While he could leave everything to Tony and just act as backup, he knew this Mandarin would most likely be a problem since he was mostly the comic book version than the movie one. The smaller portion of the base was hidden underground, but it also had the highest concentration of defenders. As Ezekiel walked through the main hallway, his men were already in the process of clearing out any obstacles. Compared to outside, the underground bunker was relatively quiet besides a few areas where gunfire was going off. Curious, Ezekiel decided to go investigate the noise and headed down a different corridor to investigate. He quickly reached what looked like a hangar and froze in place for a few moments before he asked in a confused tone, "Why the hell is Madara running on the walls and using guns?" Izuna appeared next to Ezekiel a second later and rubbed the back of his head as he awkwardly said, "We watched a bunch of John Woo movies, The Matrix and Equilibrium." Ezekiel watched Madara flip off the side of the wall and spin in the air like a top as he continuously fired his two pistols before he landed in the middle of the room like a gymnast. As soon as he landed, everyone still standing in the room collapsed to the ground with a bullet in the middle of their forehead. Ezekiel's right eye started to twitch as Azuna clapped excitedly and said, "Good job, brother." Ezekiel shook his head slightly and went back to the main hall instead of dealing with whatever just happened. As Ezekiel continued his journey deeper into the base, he passed plenty of dead bodies along with his troops and a few handfuls of prisoners. While he originally had plans to turn the Origination into something similar to the Hand, most of its members were hardcore terrorists. He didn't need to search their minds since they kept pretty decent mission records, which was a surprise to be sure, but apparently the Mandarin was extremely thorough and had them keep paper records of everything they did. That was what Ezekiel used to determine who at least stayed alive long enough to see if they qualified to live and join one of the groups he ran. After a few turns down different hallways and a few sets of stairs, Ezekiel finally stopped in front of the Mandarin's main chambers. In front of the door stood White Fang and a couple of other Umbu with their masks on. White Fang stepped out of the way and gestured towards the door as he said, "From the camera feeds, he hasn't left and seems to be waiting for us." Ezekiel nodded as he said, "All right, I'll handle it myself. Seal the door and don't let anyone inside after me." White Fang and the others disappeared from view a second later, but Ezekiel could feel them now spread out and hidden even in the brightly lit hallway. Ezekiel closed his eyes for a few moments before he opened them, and his Manjikyu Sharingan slowly spun into place. Ezekiel confidently opened the door and walked inside before he shut it and felt a powerful ceiling barrier fall into place. The room he entered was dimly lit by torches and looked almost like a throne room with a large open area cut down the middle by a red carpet. The carpet led all the way to a set of stairs and flowed up them to a platform with a golden throne in the middle of it. Seated on the throne with a relaxed posture was a man of Asian descent with long black hair and a long Fu Manchu-styled mustache. He wore a voluminous green robe with a lot of gold trim and matching green hat. Ezekiel studied the man as he approached closer, while the man in turn studied Ezekiel. Ezekiel was in his normal appearance of black slacks, a long-sleeved button-up shirt not tucked into his pants, and some dress shoes. When Ezekiel reached about halfway to the throne, he said, "I would have dressed up if I knew you wanted to cosplay." The Mandarin barely frowned as he said in a displeased voice, "The mysterious Ezekiel, friend of Tony Stark and owner of Vibe Incorporated." The Mandarin's eyes narrowed as he said, "You've come to my territory and attacked my base and people." The Mandarin slowly stood to his full height while he arrogantly stared down at Ezekiel before lightning streaked towards the ceiling as he snarled, "Just who gave you the balls to think you could challenge the Mandarin?" "My mother." 00246. Performance issue. The Mandarin paused for a moment, confusion in his eyes before the lightning streaked towards Ezekiel as he yelled, "Stop with the stupid jokes." Ezekiel threw a single kunai with a chakra string attached through the lightning and towards the ground. The chakra string wasn't attached to him and only lasted a few seconds but worked perfectly as a lightning rod. As the lightning attack arced towards the kunai, Ezekiel smirked slightly as he said, "That was a pretty decent light show. Do you have anything else you want to share?" The Mandarin raised his arms towards Ezekiel as he snarled, "Die." A vortex of ice and fire erupted from Mandarin before it flew towards Ezekiel, who didn't move as it passed through him and slammed into the door behind him. Ezekiel calmly glanced behind him at the destruction caused by 3 rings being used in combination before he turned back towards Mandarin and said in a sarcastic tone, "So scary. That almost hit me." The Mandarin shot out more attacks from his rings towards Ezekiel that all passed through him like he didn't exist. After a few moments, Ezekiel disappeared into the cloud of debris that was kicked up by his attacks. For the next couple minutes, the Mandarin continued his relentless assault as he used most of his rings to attack where Ezekiel was. When he finally stopped his attacks to let the air clear, he said, "Stupid fool." The sound of 1,000 chirping birds filled the air behind the Mandarin, and his eyes widened as he realized he couldn't move at all. A lightning-covered hand punched completely through his chest and pulverized his heart a moment later as Ezekiel said, "That you are." The Mandarin's eyes widened even more and blood leaked from his mouth as he gasped for breath before Ezekiel ripped his hand out of his chest. The Mandarin clenched his fists together as he dropped to his knees, and a moment later Ezekiel noticed his heart being rebuilt. Ezekiel frowned as a kunai appeared in his hand at the same time before he swiped it through the man's ghostly neck. Just before the Mandarin's heart could fully reform, Ezekiel used his other eye to look into the future. He saw the Mandarin's heart fully reform and his chest start to heal before his body disappeared. Ezekiel immediately cast a spell to see invisible objects before he looked into the future again. This time he saw the Mandarin turn invisible as he stood up before the man, seemed to blur as he sped away from Ezekiel before the vision finished. Ezekiel paused as he waited for the right moment, and right as the Mandarin disappeared, Ezekiel moved. Although the Mandarin thought he was invisible, Ezekiel saw him clearly as his kunai sliced clean through the man's neck and decapitated him. The Mandarin's face wore a stunned expression as his head spun through the air and his body fell completely forward onto the stairs and slid down them. Ezekiel followed along a second later before he stopped by the corpse and gingerly collected the rings before he stored them in a special scroll for safekeeping. After he placed the scroll in his pocket dimension, Ezekiel moved away from the body before he used fire release to burn it to ash. About a minute later, Ezekiel exited the room and said, "I'm done here. You guys can clean up." Ezekiel headed back out of the secret base, and once he arrived, he found the fighting over. The firepower on the new suits made it ridiculously easy for the two men to completely dominate the area. Tony and Rhodey were both off to the side, still in their armor, as they watched Ezekiel's men bring out their prisoners. While a good portion of the terrorists were killed, Ezekiel's team selected over 1,000 people worth checking. Whether or not they passed the following checks were another matter, but Ezekiel was fine with that. Tony noticed Ezekiel first and waved to him as he walked over before he asked after his helmet opened up, "What happened? I thought you were going to join us." "I did. I was just underground fighting their leader," Ezekiel said as he pointed with his thumb over his shoulder. Tony's eyes widened as he noticed Ezekiel's blood-stained arm and asked, "Hey, is your arm okay?" Ezekiel moved his arm over, glanced at it for a moment before he chanted a spell and waved his other arm over it. A second later, an orange and gold light covered his arm to clean it as Ezekiel said, "My arm's fine. I just stuck it through the leader's chest." "You killed the Mandarin?" Rhodey asked in surprise as Tony frowned slightly and asked, "Didn't you say we would fight him together?" Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "He didn't leave his personal chamber in the bottom of the base. You would have had a terrible time fighting him down there, so I took care of it." Tony actually pouted at Ezekiel, who rolled his eyes as he said, "Don't make that face. It's gross. Save that shit for Pepper." Rhodey chuckled slightly before he glanced around and asked, "So what now? Are we just waiting for the cleanup to finish?" "Pretty much. We just need to finish cleaning out everything of value, and then we can leave." Tony glanced at the rows of prisoners for a few moments before he asked, "Aren't these guys all terrorists? Didn't you say the plan was to wipe them out?" "We did. At least the main branch. We'll need to process all the data we collected before we can completely finish them off." Tony gestured to the prisoners as he asked, "What about those guys? What are you going to do with them?" "They will be screened, and if they pass, they'll be able to live and hopefully do something worthwhile with their new lease on life." Tony glanced around one more time before he asked, "I guess me and Rhodey are done here. Want to send us home?" Ezekiel pointed towards a large cave off in the distance that disappeared into the mountainside as he said, "There's a slightly disassembled alien spaceship over there if you want to check it out." Tony's helmet snapped closed, and he took off without another word, which made Ezekiel chuckle slightly before he asked, "Want to check it out too, or head back?" "I have nothing else to do," Rhodey said before his helmet snapped closed, and he followed after Tony. Ezekiel didn't even bother to run and opened a portal before he stepped into the cave directly. Once inside, he used magic to light up the place before Tony arrived a few seconds later, quickly followed by Rhodey. The cave itself was pretty massive, which is why it was easily visible from the base. A few thousand feet from the entrance itself, and partly hidden behind rocks, stalactites and stalagmites that developed over the years, was a hidden spaceship. The ship was partly disabled, but it didn't look like the Mandarin trusted other people to touch it since it was mostly intact. Off to one side of the cave was the alien who originally owned the ship, and his corpse was surprisingly still in one piece. If the sword stuck the creature's head wasn't a dead giveaway, Ezekiel would almost think it was sleeping. Ezekiel walked over to the creature he knew as Axon Kar, a peaceful Makluan explorer who wondered if intelligent life existed outside of his own galaxy, only for it to end in tragedy. If only he arrived later or didn't come to Earth at all, he would have probably lived. But his ship crash-landed on Earth a long time ago, and the people attacked him thinking he was some type of monster when all he wanted was help to fix his ship. Mortally wounded, he retreated to the cave where his ship crashed and hid for centuries. The locals never explored the area because of local superstitions and its extremely remote location. The Mandarin was the first person to actually explore the cave, and that was where he found the rings and killed Aksankar. Ezekiel shook his head slightly at the poor alien's fate before he removed the sword from his head and sealed him away. While there wasn't much he could do for them now, he could at least give them a proper burial and maybe make them a nice monument to go with it. Aksankar did give him 10 unique power rings. It was the least Ezekiel could do even if he didn't use them. Tony watched what Ezekiel did with the alien and excitedly asked, "Was that an alien corpse? What are you going to do with it?" "Study it." Ezekiel shook his head before he explained what he knew about Aksankar to Tony and Rhodey. After learning about the alien and Ezekiel's idea, he nodded in agreement as he said, "He might not be human, but I think that's a great idea. Maybe even place it on Mars in one of the parks or something." Ezekiel frowned at Tony as Rhodey asked, "What do you mean by placing it on Mars?" Tony glanced back at Ezekiel with widened eyes before Ezekiel shook his head and said, "We've been terraforming Mars for a few years at this point, and people can live on it already. We still need to ship in food and stuff, but otherwise it's livable." Rhodey glanced between the two of them for a few moments before he asked, "Wait, you're both serious? How the hell does no one know about it?" "A mix of magic, science, and hacking every electronic device capable of looking at Mars. As for normal telescopes, that's where the magic comes in. Earth already has a magic shield built to protect it from magic threats. I copied that design and placed it on Mars with some help after I added a small enchant rune that makes Mars look like it used to." Rhodey frowned as he asked, "Why didn't you guys tell me sooner? It's ultra top secret. Honestly, only 5 people even knew about it when we started the whole project." Ezekiel said before he quickly added, "Even now it's less than 100 people who know, and they are all working on the project directly." Ezekiel patted Tony on the shoulder as he said, "Tony hasn't even told Pepper or Happy about the project yet." Tony glanced away from Ezekiel, which made him frown as he asked, "Tony, you didn't tell them, right?" "I might have, maybe, brought it up during dinner one time, when Anna was visiting. But I told Pepper before that when we crashed my car on Mars." Ezekiel face-palmed as he said, "And this is exactly why I told Pepper you would never be able to keep your Iron Man identity a secret." Rhodey nodded in agreement before he asked, "So when can I visit Mars?" Ezekiel let out a sigh before Jarvis said through one of the suit's speakers, "You could take him and Tony tomorrow so we could collect data on how the suits handle in different gravity. We could also check how they handle flying through space since the suits are shielded and hermetically sealed." "Fine," Ezekiel grumbled as he shot a glare at Tony, who didn't even pretend to look guilty. A few minutes later, all of them were on the partly disassembled spacecraft as Ezekiel looked it over. It definitely wasn't in the best of shape. Time had eaten away at parts of it, and others parts were completely missing. As they walked through the ship, Ezekiel would randomly create a clone to check different parts of it. While he didn't have much hope, he still wanted to double-check the ship for anything that might be important. Once he finished searching the ship, he planned to have it completely disassembled and melted down to be reused. It wasn't like he was in serious need of alien technology anyways. He would randomly visit Sakar whenever Tony needed new stuff to research. It wasn't too often, but at least once every 6 months he would pick up a load of stuff for Tony to play with. Part of it was junk, part of it turned out to be different versions of stuff Tony already figured out, and the rest was either new tech or new broken tech. The broken tech wouldn't be fixed, but Tony would still disassemble it to figure out what it was and how it worked. Tony would then take that knowledge, and if the technology was worth the effort, he would make a working version. It was something that most people would think was impossible, but it was something Tony's already done multiple times over the years. After exploring the entire ship with the help of clones, the only thing really worth anything were some massive data storage racks. They were currently powered off, but Ezekiel determined they were still in good condition and might work if hooked up to a proper power source. Once they were all stored away, they exited the ship and Ezekiel used a special portal spell to transfer the ship to Mars where it could be fully dismantled. As they walked towards the exit of the cave, Tony glanced towards Ezekiel and said, "Since Happy, Anna, and Rhodey all know about Mars, you think Happy and Anna can do their wedding there?" Ezekiel rolled his eyes before he asked, "Really? I thought the plan was to do everything on Genosha." "That's the current plan, but I know Happy and Anna said it would be nice to have it on Mars, and wanted me to ask you if that would be possible." Ezekiel glanced towards Tony for a few moments before he realized something and said with a smirk, "You know what? Since it's Happy and Anna, we can do that." 00247. Christmas 2008. Christmas Eve 2008. Ezekiel left his house after a quiet dinner with his family to meet up with his helpers for the night. Ezekiel stepped out of the portal to the doorstep of Hulk's house on Genosha. He barely knocked on the door before it was flung open and an energetic girl slammed into him as she exclaimed, "Ezekiel." Ezekiel smiled as he returned the hug as he said, "It's good to see you too, Gabby." Gabby's smile was almost blinding as she looked up at Ezekiel and asked, "Is it time?" Ezekiel chuckled slightly as he walked into the house, while Gabby excitedly skipped next to him before he said, "Almost. We need to change first." Hela, who was at the kitchen table with Hulk, glanced up from the board game they were playing as she asked, "Change? I thought we were just dropping off gifts." "We are, but we also need to get into the proper holiday spirit." Hulk nodded in agreement as he said, "Hulk like being elf." Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "Hulk, speak like a normal person." "No, Hulk don't wanna." Ezekiel shook his head again as he mumbled, "This must be his rebellious phase." Hulk played his turn before he said, "Gabby, it's your turn." "Okay," Gabby said as she ran back over to the table before she started to play her turn. Ezekiel followed behind and took a seat next to Hela as he asked, "Playing life, huh? Who's in the lead?" "It's honestly pretty close, but I think Hulk is in the lead though," Hela said as she started her own turn. Ezekiel chatted with everyone as they finished out the game before Hulk raised his hands in the air and said, "Hulk win. Hulk best at life." Ezekiel shook his head before he helped pack up the game and then stored it away next to the massive collection of board games Hulk owned. Afterwards, he turned around and asked, "Are you guys ready to go deliver presents?" Hela and Hulk nodded while Gabby bounced up and down as she excitedly said, "Yes." "All right, let's get everyone in costume and then we can head out," Ezekiel said as he pulled out special henge seals. Gabby bounced in front of Ezekiel first and stuck out her arm as she said, "I'm ready." Ezekiel chuckled as he placed the seal on her arm before he injected Chakra into it and activated the seal. A cloud of smoke appeared, and a moment later Gabby reappeared in a mostly green outfit along with a green hat and shoes. Her hair was hidden under the Santa hat, and it showed off her pointed ears that twitched slightly as she ran over to the mirror by the front door. Gabby giggled with excitement as she looked herself over in the mirror, and Ezekiel moved in front of Hulk. A moment later, a large smoke cloud enveloped Hulk, and when it cleared, he was a lot smaller and in the same outfit as Gabby. The only difference was he was still green, and instead of being skinny, he was extra wide, which made Ezekiel smile. Ezekiel then turned to Hela, and just before he attached the seal, she said, "You better not make me an elf. Do you want to be Santa instead? Aren't you supposed to be Santa?" Hela asked, which caused Ezekiel to nod before she asked with an expectant look, "Then that means I should be Mrs. Claus, don't you think?" Ezekiel's eyes widened slightly, but didn't answer before he placed the seal on her arm and injected Chakra. A cloud of smoke later, and Hela now looked like a fat, little old lady with white hair. Her outfit was a red-colored dress that went to her ankles with a matching hat, shoes, and a pair of half-rimmed glasses sat on her now bulbous nose. As Ezekiel changed into Santa, Hela glanced down at her new appearance, and her mouth twitched slightly before she moved to look in the mirror. As soon as she saw her full appearance, she spun around and shot a glare at Ezekiel, who now looked exactly like Jolly Saint Nick. With his massive belly that giggled when he walked, his large white beard, and iconic suit. Gabby was already excited as she looked at Hela's transformation. But when she noticed Ezekiel, her eyes practically glowed as she said, "You look just like Santa." Hela stared at Ezekiel for a few moments, who smirked back and gave her a wink. Hela's eyes narrowed slightly before she pulled off the seal on her arm and changed back to normal. A second later, Hela used magic to change into what could only be considered a sexy Mrs. Claus outfit. It was a low-cut, skin-tight, red dress that stopped mid-thigh, while white stocking covered the rest of her legs and ended just short of the dress to show off the tiniest bit of bare skin. She still had a red Santa hat on, but instead of red shoes, she now wore high-heeled red boots that stopped at her knees. Ezekiel noticed her outfit, and his mouth dropped slightly open as she purposely bent forward and allowed him to see down the top of her dress while she adjusted her boots. She tilted her head up and locked eyes with him before she gave him a confident smirk and a wink as she slowly stood up straight. Gabby, who just finished checking out Ezekiel, turned around to see Hela's new look and said, "Wow, you look amazing. I want to wear something like that too." Ezekiel glanced at Gabby and his right eye started to twitch before he said, "Maybe next time. We need to get going." "Oh, okay." Ezekiel opened up a portal to the place where he stored all the presents and decorations he planned to use this year. After collecting everything that was already stored in special sacks, the group headed for their first stop, the main secret base. The base itself was relatively quiet at this time, since Ezekiel didn't like people doing missions around the holidays. The four of them only ran into a handful of people who were up and about as they entered the cafeteria area. Once there, Ezekiel pulled out a massive tree and set it up near the entrance. As Gabby and Hulk decorated the tree, Hela helped Ezekiel hang up other decorations before they pulled out all the presents Ezekiel prepared. It took almost an hour before they were finished, and afterwards they headed for their next destination. At the Xavier Institute, they set up another tree and unloaded another pile of presents. As for their next destination, Ezekiel stopped at every hand outreach center they created and dropped off presents for all the people who attended them. It was mostly for the kids, but even teens and the adults going through job training received appropriate gifts. The next stop after that was orphanages around the USA, Canada, and Mexico. Ezekiel and his team didn't stop at all of them himself, since they wouldn't have enough time. So while they stopped by a handful, ninjas, clones, and help from sorcerers made the rest possible. His clones also dropped off presents for Ezekiel's friends like Tony, Tao, Hela, Hulk, and others. Once they were finished, Ezekiel and his group ended up visiting over 50 locations before Ezekiel took them to eat a late-night snack at Hulk's house. When they arrived, Hulk found his house completely decorated with a large tree and a handful of gifts placed under his tree. Hulk stared at the tree and presents for a few moments before he looked at Ezekiel and asked, "When did we decorate my house?" "We didn't. It must have been the real Santa," Ezekiel said with a hint of a smile as he shrugged. Hulk glanced between the tree and Ezekiel a couple times before he asked, "Can I open them?" "Tomorrow morning after you wake up. For now, let's eat and then call it a night." Hulk nodded in agreement before he headed towards the kitchen table where Ezekiel pulled out a bunch of sealed food. He placed fresh pizzas, pasta, salad, and a bunch of other things on the table along with drinks before he took a seat next to Hela. As they started eating, Gabby munched on a large piece of pizza before she asked, "Ezekiel, are you doing anything special tomorrow?" "I always spend major holidays with my family." "Oh, okay," Gabby said in a slightly depressed tone. Ezekiel studied Gabby's expression for a few moments before he asked, "Did you want me to visit you tomorrow?" Gabby's eyes widened before she looked a little guilty as she nodded and said, "Yeah, but I didn't know you had plans with your family." "It's fine. I could take a little while to drop by and say hello since I know you don't like clones. But it won't be for that long." Gabby's eyes instantly lit up and she nodded her head quickly as she said, "Stopping by is good enough for me. All right, I'll shoot for some time before lunch." The rest of the meal passed pretty quickly with Hulk eating a lion's share of the food. Afterwards, everyone said goodbye to Hulk before Ezekiel and Hela sent Gabby back home. Ezekiel then escorted Hela home before he said, "I'll see you tomorrow night." Hela smiled slightly as she said, "Sure, I'll see you tomorrow." When Theo arrived back home, he had a little over 3 hours of sleep before something heavy landed on him. To be precise, 2 heavy things landed on him and knocked the air from his legs as they said, "Merry Christmas. It's time to wake up." Theo's eyes snapped open to find his siblings smiling at him as they laid on top of him. Theo locked eyes with both of them before he said in an annoyed tone, "I hope you know. There will be consequences for your actions." Millie shared a glance with Isaac before they both jumped off the bed and bolted for the door at incredible speed. Theo practically exploded from his bed as he charged after them and caught them both as they entered the kitchen. A second after he tackled them to the floor, he summoned a handful of clones who piled on top of them. Within moments, laughter filled the air as Theo and his clones held down his siblings and tickled them both. "Mercy, mercy. We give up," Millie quickly said in between fits of laughter. Theo didn't let up for a second as Jacob entered the kitchen and looked over the situation before he completely ignored it as he walked past them to get to the coffee pot. Daniel walked in a few moments later, glanced at Theo and his clones still tickling his siblings before she asked, "What exactly is going on here?" Theo glanced up at his mom as he said, "Just teaching both of them that jumping on someone isn't the proper way to wake them up." "Oh, all right, finish up soon. We are leaving in the next half an hour," Daniel said with a slight shake of her head as Jacob handed her a coffee mug. Millie and Isaac begged for help, in between their laughter for over a minute before Theo finally let them go. Afterwards, he headed downstairs and took a quick shower before he got ready for the day. When he walked back out of the kitchen, he found his entire family waiting for him with smiles on their faces and a pile of boxes resting on the coffee table. Theo saw the size and shape of the box and was instantly filled with dread as he knew what was coming. He spun on his heel, but before he could even take a step, his mother said, "Come on, it's a family tradition. Yeah, it's just a few hours. Besides, everyone else is doing it." Theo raised an eyebrow as he glanced over his shoulder and said, "That's the type of thing people say when they want you to try drugs. Do you want me to say yes to them too?" Jacob shared a glance with Daniel, who frowned slightly before he said, "All right, I said that wrong. The rest of the family will be wearing them, and it'd be nice if you did too. At least long enough for a group photo. Then you can take it off." Theo paused for a few seconds before he let out a defeated sigh and turned around. His family smiled as he took the box from them, and before he could even open it, they picked up their own boxes. A few moments later, Theo's right eye started to twitch as he looked at what he could only describe as holiday vomit. It still amazed Theo to know that for some reason his family had the ability to find the worst sweaters possible each year. He was honestly starting to think Jacob and the others got together each year and had them custom made, only for the simple fact that there was no way other people would want the hideous things. With another helpless sigh, Theo slowly put on the sweater before he followed his family out the door. Like every year, they were going to May and Ben's to spend the day. But unlike before, their house was no longer going to be overcrowded. After Theo shared his secrets with his family, he upgraded the houses in their neighborhood. It wasn't too crazy, and most people wouldn't notice it with the high fences and landscaping that hid most of it. But Theo Hand basically doubled the square footage of his family's homes and hid it all from street view. Even an overhead view wouldn't show anything unless you compared pictures of how it used to look. Sure, it took up some of the backyard from each property, but they all had overly large backyards to begin with. Theo also took that time to not only reinforce each home, but he also upgraded everything inside them. While it wasn't necessary to do, Theo did it anyway because he could, and it didn't really cost much. As they stepped up to the front door, Daniel faintly smiled at Theo before she stepped through the door, followed by everyone else. Theo missed her smile and was the last person through the door. But as he stepped through it, his whole body froze in place. Just past the entryway, in the middle of the new living room, stood Hela. While that wouldn't normally cause him to freeze, what she was wearing did. She was currently wearing the exact same ugly sweater as the rest of his family. Hela turned towards Theo a moment later, and when they locked eyes, she said with a smile, "Merry Christmas." Theo stared at her for a few seconds in the ugly sweater she was wearing before he finally let out a sigh and said in a defeated tone, "Merry Christmas to you too." Theo closed the door, and as he stepped into the house past the entryway, he froze again. Seated in the living room was Tao, Agatha, and Hulk, who also had the same ugly sweater on. Theo was about ready to make a portal to Tony's house when Tao caught his eyes and smiled as she said, "I didn't know your family had such a tradition, but I find it interesting." Agatha nodded in agreement as she said, "I must admit, the sweater is starting to grow on me." Hulk liked pretty sweater. Theo stared at all of them before he slowly turned towards Hela with hope in his eyes. Out of everyone here, she wouldn't be corrupted. Hela noticed Theo's look and smiled before she said, "Honestly, it's pretty comfortable." The light left Theo's eyes as he said in a broken tone, "You were the chosen one. You were supposed to bring balance to this madness, not join them." A presence smacked Theo in the side of the head and made him stumble slightly as Tao said, Stop quoting Star Wars. It's not that serious. Theo looked over to see the present floating next to his head as Tao added, Merry Christmas. Theo accepted the gift while he grumbled about everyone being crazy. Afterwards, he joined everyone in the kitchen for breakfast before he spent the rest of the day with his family and the handful of people who knew who he was. Well, except Fury, but he was spending time with his own family. 00248, happily ever after. After finding out that Anna and Happy wanted their wedding held on Mars, Ezekiel met up with them and discussed the details. After confirming everything, Ezekiel scouted out a good spot before he spent over a month building everything out. Besides using clones, ninjas, and a few metahumans with certain powers to help sculpt the environment, Ezekiel also worked with Tao and Agatha to create a one-of-a-kind wedding venue. A lot of work went into the whole thing, and Ezekiel planned to keep it as a park after the wedding was done. Partly so Anna and Happy could visit it again, and partly because it would be a waste to only use it once. Sure, he could have turned it into some kind of permanent wedding venue, but he figured that would make it a little less special for Anna and Happy if he did that. The place he picked was nestled in the valley on the peak of a mountain range. It was so high up that once the weather settled properly on the planet, it would be filled with snow year-round. Well, that was before Ezekiel set up runes that kept the temperature around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The valley itself wasn't that large, being only a little more than a quarter-mile in size. Most of the construction time went into shaping the valley itself, and Ezekiel even turned one area into a sheer cliff. The cliff showed off the view of the mountain range below that led out to hills, plains, and a massive body of water in the distance. Even though most of the view was filled with browns and reds, Ezekiel had Storm create a snowstorm that covered the entire mountain range. Storm recreated the snowstorm each day for 2 weeks straight until the entire mountain range was coated in white. The view it gave from the top of the cliff face was one of a kind, and Ezekiel spent a lot of time getting it perfect. He used clones and earth release to sculpt everything the way he wanted until he was satisfied. Since it was the spot where he planned for Anna and Happy to say their vows, he spent weeks on it while other people handled the rest of the valley. He also added safety features with magic to prevent people from falling off the cliff. He would have used guardrails or something else, but it would ruin the view, and he had magic. So an entire runic script was set up to create an invisible barrier that was 10 feet tall that blocked the edge of the cliff. Once he was satisfied with that, he let the ninjas and his clones finish off the rest of the work on the valley. It was mostly designed as a fantasy-style park, with trees that were shaped to act as benches along the pathways. The pathways were made from earth release and made to resemble stones, except they were perfectly flat and even. Then water release was used to create a lake near the edge of the valley close to the cliff. The lake was half-ringed by 15 trees, and those trees were grown with wood release. Those 15 trees were then guided by a meta-human to connect together and form an elevated platform over the lake. It was large enough to accommodate a couple hundred people and would act as the ballroom for the wedding. The platform had a perfect view of the cliff and everything below it. But it also had a walkway from one edge that led all the way down to the platform Ezekiel set up for the ceremony. It was a temporary thing and would only be there for the wedding itself, but it would just make it that much more memorable. The plan was for Anna to walk down that path over the water for her entrance to meet Happy at the altar right next to the cliff face. As for the guests, they would be seated on benches that lined the sides of the walkway. Once the main ceremony was over, everyone would head up to the main platform over the lake for the rest of the wedding. As for the guests, Ezekiel didn't care about keeping it a secret. He talked with Anna and Happy about streaming the whole thing for the world to see. He didn't plan to mention it was on Mars or tell the guests where they were either. Only the people already in the know would be aware, and everyone else could guess where it was held. As for the wedding help, Ezekiel was using ninjas who volunteered and his clones to help out. As for the entertainment, he hired Dazzler and her band to play for an hour. The rest of the time the music would be controlled by Jarvis, and Tony even created a holographic projector for him to use so he could act as a real DJ and even move around the venue. With everything for the event ready, the only thing left was waiting for the date they picked. February 14th, 2009, Mars. Happy was in the dressing room getting ready as he stressed out. Ezekiel, Rhodey, and Tony were in the room with him helping him out, but he was still a nervous wreck. Tony was relaxed in a chair with his feet kicked up on a coffee table as he played with his phone before he said, I still think we should have done my idea for the bachelor's party. If we did that, Anna might have called the whole thing off, and you would probably be sleeping in your lab for the next month. Hey, it was just a couple of strippers. It's the normal thing to do for a bachelor's party, Tony said as he tried to defend himself. Mr. Stark tends to sleep in his lab 4 times a week already. I don't think he would consider that a punishment. Jarvis said in a happy tone from the holographic projector he was currently using. Everyone laughed at Tony, who shrugged as he said, I put a bed down there for a reason. Rhodey finished helping Happy with the finishing touches to his suit as he said, while I wasn't fully against it. I'm also the only person here who's single. What? I'm single too. Are you sure? You spend an awful lot of time with Hela the last time I checked, Tony said in a teasing tone. A guy can be good friends with a girl and not be dating them. Everyone glanced at Ezekiel for a split second before they shared a look and started laughing. Ezekiel frowned as he said, What? It's true. Rhodey patted Ezekiel on the shoulder as he said, I wish you good luck. Ezekiel swiped his hand away as he said, Shut up. Another bit of laughter broke out before someone knocked on the door and said, Just checking if you guys were about ready. There's 15 minutes before you need to get in place. We're almost done in here. Thanks for the reminder, Ezekiel said as he glanced over everyone. While Tony normally liked to stand out and be the center of attention, today he was in a matching suit along with Ezekiel, Rhodey, and Jarvis's hologram, who looked similar to Vision in his human form. Each of them wore a slate gray suit with black ties, while Happy wore a similar cut suit in black suit with a slate gray tie. It was simple, but it tied them all together in a subtle way. As they prepared to leave the dressing room, Ezekiel cast one more glance at Happy. Over the last few years after his health issues were taken care of by Tsunade, Happy worked on himself a lot. He was no longer Tony's extra-large bodyguard after he lost over 150 pounds. He was still a little husky, but with his age it just made him look normal and no longer overweight. Ezekiel did offer him a clone body without powers, but a higher metabolism, so he would almost never gain weight again. But Happy turned him down for now because Anna apparently liked his love handles. After they left the room, they headed for the main walkway and let Happy take the lead. Happy slowly walked down the aisle through all the guests who were mostly family and friends. It was actually a pretty weird mix of people, since Happy invited coworkers and people he used to train and box against, while Anna invited actors, directors, and other people in the industry she considered friends. After Happy reached the altar, his parents and grandparents walked down the aisle before they took the front seats on the right side. Next came Anna's mother and her grandparents, who took their seats on the left side of the aisle. Next came the wedding party, and it was Tony, Rhodey, Ezekiel, and Jarvis. They were paired with Pepper, a movie star friend of Anna, Hela, and another movie star friend. While Tony and the others wore slate gray suits, the bridesmaid wore bluish-gray dresses that complemented the suits. They all walked as one group down the aisle and then split off to each side before the maid of honor walked down the aisle. Next came Morgan, who wore a cute dress in a flower print, who acted as the flower girl. She was extremely excited about the whole thing and threw flowers down the aisle as she skipped along. When she reached the altar, she took her spot near the maid of honor and couldn't keep the smile off her face. Afterwards, the bride's song started to play and Anna appeared escorted by her father. Anna was dressed in a gorgeous all-white gown that was designed in a way that hid her small baby bump. She walked down the aisle with her father before he presented her to Happy and then took his place off to the side. Happy was completely stunned by her appearance and could barely speak at first. Anna, on the other hand, was relatively calm as she noticed someone was missing and asked, "Where's the officiant?" Ezekiel stepped out of his spot as he said, "Sorry, I forgot to move." As Ezekiel stepped into place between Happy and Anna, Tony asked, "Wait, did you become ordained or something?" Ezekiel smirked as he said, "Something like that. Once we're done here, they'll have all the proper paperwork to prove they're married." Ezekiel glanced between Anna and Happy as he asked, "Are you two ready to begin?" After they nodded, Ezekiel smiled slightly as he addressed everyone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered here today to witness the union of these two incredible people I consider friends." Ezekiel glanced at both of them for a moment before he asked, "Happy, do you take Anna to be your wedded wife, in the holiest state of marriage, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health?" To love and cherish for the rest of your days until death do you part. Happy nodded seriously as he stared deeply into Anna's eyes and said, I do with all my heart. The corner of Anna's eyes misted up as Ezekiel turned to her and asked, Anna, do you take Happy to be your wedded husband in the holiest state of marriage? To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health. To love and cherish for the rest of your days until death do you part. Anna nodded and her voice broke slightly as she said, I do with all my heart. Do you have your rings? Happy nodded before he turned to look at Morgan, who was standing off to the side, not really paying attention as she stared out at the cliffside view. When Morgan didn't move, Pepper reached over and touched her shoulder as she said, Morgan, sweetie, it's your turn to help out. Morgan's eyes widened as she looked back around to find everyone staring at her. She panicked for a moment and wasn't sure what to do before Ezekiel said, Please hand me the rings, Morgan. Morgan's eyes lit up before she rushed over to Ezekiel and quickly pulled out 2 boxes from her basket before she handed them to Ezekiel as she said, Sorry, Uncle Zek. Ezekiel patted her head after he took the boxes in one hand and said, You're fine. Now go back to your spot, Munchkin. With the rings in hand, Ezekiel handed the proper box to each person before he said, Please present each other with the ring you prepared. The rings were rather plain considering what most people would go with. But Anna and Happy wanted simple white gold bands with each other's names engraved on them along with the date. After they put on each other's rings, Ezekiel said, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may now kiss the bride. After the kiss and Anna breaking into tears for a few moments, the whole wedding party headed up to the main platform. On the platform was a stage for the band and DJ, a dance floor, a whole buffet packed with food and tables for everyone to sit at. Over the next couple hours, everyone mingled and celebrated the wedding. The only thing to really note was Pepper was the person who caught the flowers when Anna threw them. 00249, being a good friend. It was Friday afternoon and Theo was at his family shop with everyone. They just finished doing their homework for the weekend and he headed upstairs to help out in the shop as the others went to do their own things. Millie and Isaac were portaled home so they could practice baking, while Dylan and Teresa headed upstairs to help out in the shop with Theo. Peter, MJ, and Jean were the only ones who didn't leave the study room because Peter was tutoring them in math and science. Theo could have probably helped out and left a clone, but Peter could now make clones himself, so it wasn't needed. When Theo and the others got upstairs, they talked with Ben and were given different tasks to do, so they split up. Theo's task was to help strip down a new project car to its frame so they could clean it up, repair it, and straighten the frame out. Then it would be checked over and have all the bodywork fixed before it would be sandblasted and prepared for paint. Theo arrived at the car to find his dad inside of it as he stripped out the interior. Done with homework? Jacob asked as he was busy working the dashboard free. Theo stopped to put on some work gloves as he said, I finished it at school today. I just helped the others with theirs. Jacob nodded slightly as he said, Grab me a 1/4 inch, 10mm deep socket while you're over there. Theo quickly found the socket and also grabbed a plastic set of trim removal tools before he walked over and gave Jacob the socket. As Theo climbed into the rusted-up 1970 Buick GSX, Jacob said, Those panels are trashed and will be replaced with new ones, so you don't have to be gentle with them. All right, Theo said as he started to pry out one of the back panels before he asked, Has any plans been made for summer vacation? We are thinking about doing the same thing as last year since portals make it really convenient to make last-minute travel plans. Plus, we don't need to worry about booking places to stay. Theo pried off the first panel and tossed it out of the car into a pile of junk on the floor before he said, Sounds good to me. I know Millie and Isaac have a list of places in France, Austria, and Japan they want to visit. Jacob shook his head as he said, I don't even need to ask to know what those two want to see there. Well, with their punishment over, it makes sense they want to try a bunch of sweets they didn't get to try last year. The sound of something snapping was instantly followed by a thud before Jacob said, Motherfucker. While technically you are one, I'm pretty sure Mom would be pissed if she heard you say that. Theo said in a joking tone as he glanced over to see Jacob cradling his hand as blood dripped from his knuckles. You didn't hear that. Jacob said as he glanced around for a moment to make sure no one else was close by. Theo chuckled as he reached out for Jacob's hand and said, Yeah, don't worry, I won't tell Mom. Let me see it. Jacob held out his hand towards Theo, who used healing jutsu on it. Within moments under the green light from Theo's palm, Jacob's split knuckles quickly knit back together and healed completely. Jacob nodded slightly as he said, "Thanks. Now help me pull this dash out. It should be disconnected now." Theo moved to the front of the car, and with some teamwork, they pulled the dash out before they put it on a table with other things they were saving. Afterwards, they managed to completely strip the rest of the interior before it was time to close the shop. As they cleaned up, Theo glanced around and didn't see Peter, so after he washed up, he headed downstairs to grab him. As Theo opened the door, he heard Peter say, "Forget it. Whatever you two say goes. My girlfriends are always right after all. We never agreed to be your girlfriends." MJ and Jean replied in perfect sync as Theo froze in place as he listened. "You both kissed me, and now you don't want to take responsibility?" Peter asked in a teasing voice. "You kissed both of us. Then we should even the score? Both of you should kiss me back," Peter said in a confident tone. "You can't trick us into kissing you again," Jean said before MJ said, "Okay. What? You can't just agree, you have to make him work for it," Jean said in an exasperated tone. "But that kiss felt great, and I want to try it again." "But we had a plan," Jean said in a disappointed tone before she quickly added, "Fine, but I'm next." Theo heard movement from inside the room, but decided not to open the door fully as he said, "You guys have 10 minutes to finish up whatever you're doing in there before you need to come upstairs. We are closing up, it's time to go home." Theo heard a bunch of movement from inside the room as he added in a joking tone, "Also maybe lock the door next time you guys are studying biology." Theo didn't wait for a reply as he firmly closed the door and headed back upstairs. He thought about teasing them more or even telling everyone else so they could join in, but he didn't want to ruin whatever Peter had going on with MJ and Jean, so he said nothing. But that didn't stop him from flashing a knowing smirk at the three when they entered the shop from the basement. All three of them blushed slightly and tried to avoid him as they prepared to leave. Even on the walk back home, all three were pretty quiet and didn't talk much. MJ and Jean actually lived only one street over from everyone else, so they walked most of the way with the group before they split off to go home. Once Theo arrived home, he helped make dinner with Jacob. After dinner was finished, the entire extended family met up for training before they called it a night. As everyone else went to bed, Theo met up with Tao and Agatha for some magic training before he visited Hela for a couple hours. Afterwards, he headed home and fell asleep for a few hours before he woke up to spend Saturday working on his personal car with his dad. Theo saw Peter throughout the day, but didn't bring up the incident he stumbled upon the other day. He figured if Peter wanted to talk about it, he would bring it up himself. After spending the day building his car with his dad, Theo had dinner with his family before he went to pick up Morgan from Tony's house. As Ezekiel stepped out of the portal into Tony's living room, Jarvis said, "Mr. and Mrs. Stark are upstairs getting ready, and Morgan is currently playing in her toy room." "Thanks, Jarvis. Let Tony know I'm here and I'm with Morgan," Ezekiel said as he walked upstairs. When Ezekiel stepped into Morgan's toy room, he found her having a tea party with some stuffed animals. When she noticed Ezekiel, she jumped up and ran over to him as she said, "Uncle Zek." Ezekiel scooped her up and spun around with her in his arms as he asked, "Are you ready to stay up late and have a bunch of fun?" "Yes." Morgan squealed as she spun around in the air. "She can stay up, but not too late," Pepper said from the door. "And don't feed her a bunch of sweets this time. She was hyped up on sugar for almost a week," Tony added as he put his arm around Pepper's waist. Ezekiel stopped the spin as he shared a look with Morgan and said, "Oh, it's the fun police. You remember what to do, right?" Morgan nodded her head seriously before Ezekiel set her on his shoulders. A moment later, both of them pulled down the bottom of their right eye and blew a raspberry towards Tony and Pepper. At the same time, Ezekiel created a portal under his feet, and they fell through it within less than a second. Tony groaned as he said, "What the hell? I'm not the fun police." Jarvis chimed in as he said in a happy tone, "Unfortunately in this case, you are, sir." "No way. I don't want to be the fun police." Pepper giggled as she led Tony out of the room as she said, "Come along, Officer Stark. We need to finish getting ready for that charity event. And if you behave, you'll get a reward when we get home." Ezekiel and Morgan fell through the portal and landed in the medical base where someone else was waiting for them. Morgan, who was on Ezekiel's shoulders, noticed the other person, and a moment later, hidden memories flooded back into her mind. As the same thing happened to the other person, Morgan's face lit up as she yelled, "Riri!" Morgan! Riri yelled back as she ran towards the other girl as Ezekiel put her on the ground. They both hugged each other tightly for a few moments before they both started to excitedly talk with each other. Ezekiel watched them for a few seconds before he opened a portal and waved them towards it as he said, "Come along, you two. You can catch up when we get to Hulk's." Neither girl stopped talking as they held hands and walked through the portal. On the other side, they stepped out of the portal onto Hulk's doorstep. Ezekiel knocked on the door as the portal closed behind him, and a few seconds later his clone opened the door. The clone let them inside before it dispelled itself, so he could gain its memories. Inside the house at the kitchen table was Hulk and Hela, who were in the middle of playing a card game. As Ezekiel moved to take up the cards his clone left for him, Riri and Morgan went over to the couch first to talk. It was only the 5th time they've met, but they already had a system down. As soon as their locked memories surfaced at the sight of each other, they would talk about what happened since the last time they met. Afterwards, they would basically be inseparable until it was time to go back home. When that happened, their memories would be sealed away as soon as they separated. As for why they had sealed memories, it was because he didn't want either of the moms or Tony to know he had more than one kid for now. While Pepper would probably be okay with it, and probably suspects Tony has a couple of illegitimate kids, Maya, on the other hand, would probably freak out about it because she apparently has feelings for Tony. Even though she's still upset, he hasn't even attempted to contact her ever since the day he knocked her up. Even though both girls were still young, with Morgan being almost 3 and Riri being almost 9. Both girls inherited Tony's intellect and were incredibly smart and could be considered geniuses. They would both probably act like little geniuses too, if Ezekiel didn't spoil the two girls and treat them like the little kids they were. While the two girls talked, Ezekiel played cards with Hela and Hulk as they waited for the girls to finish catching up. Hela glanced at the girls from her place at the table as she said, "I never thought kids were cute, but Morgan and Riri changed my mind. Little one's cute, but always beat Hulk at games." Hulk said in an annoyed tone as he huffed, "It can't be helped. Those two are sharp. They've even beat me and Hela before." Ezekiel said with a careless shrug. It wasn't long before they finished up their card game and didn't start a new game. Instead, they cleared the table, and Ezekiel pulled out food so everyone could eat dinner before they played board games for the rest of the night. Once the table was filled with food, Ezekiel glanced over at the couch as he said, "Dinner time, you two. Come eat, and you can keep talking over here." Morgan's eyes lit up as she asked, "Can we have cookies?" "Eat normal food first, and then you can try the cookies my little sister made." "Yes," Morgan excitedly said as she jumped off the couch and pulled Riri with her. For the rest of the night, the group hung out at Hulk's house and played board games. For the kids, when it got later and they both started to doze off, Ezekiel gave them some espresso-infused desserts that kept them awake for the rest of the night. When it was around 9 in the morning Pacific time, Ezekiel took the girls who were still hyped up on sugar and caffeine home to their parents. 00250 Root. It was just before summer break when Ezekiel received a short message from Fury that read, "We need to talk." Theo had a couple of ideas of what it could be about, but he wasn't completely sure since he had so many projects going on. Since Fury didn't say when, Theo finished up what he was doing at his family shop before he transformed into Ezekiel and portaled to the main base. Once there, Ezekiel found Fury, Maria Hill, and Phil Coulson in a meeting room waiting for him. Fury didn't look up from the tablet he was using as he said, "Took you long enough. You never specified a time, and I was in the middle of something," Ezekiel said as he took a seat and nodded towards the other two in the room. Fury frowned slightly as he said, "I don't contact you often, but when I do, I would at least expect you to at least consider the matter urgent. I'll keep that in mind for next time. So what's the issue?" Maria handed Ezekiel a tablet with satellite footage of something flying through the air quickly. Then it changed to shaky camera footage of something flying through the sky incredibly fast. The last clip actually showed decent footage of Tony in his suit flying around and fighting people somewhere in the desert. Ezekiel nodded slightly as he watched, and when he handed the tablet back, he asked, "Okay, so what's the problem? When and how did Tony make a suit? Wasn't he supposed to be captured and taken hostage for months in Afghanistan?" Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "Me being here changed to many things, and Stain never started his back market weapon deals." Fury nodded slightly before he said, that's a given. But it doesn't explain why Tony has a suit and is running around fighting terrorists. Ezekiel pulled out his personal tablet and pulled up some files before he sent them to everyone in the room. Fury started to go through everything as he asked, "Why didn't you inform me of this when it happened?" "Because we agreed to stay out of each other's business." Fury looked up at Ezekiel before he asked, "Tony is supposed to be part of the Avengers. That would fall under part of my business, don't you think?" "True, but I've never liked the idea of the Avengers. They always seem to be on the back foot," Ezekiel said as he shook his head before he added, "You know how I am. I would rather be proactive than reactive when it comes to threats involving Earth. So I've been thinking of making an entirely new superhero team instead. One that will target and go after threats before they harm us." The others focused on Ezekiel, who smiled as he asked, "What? You thought I was just going to let everything happen and not try to change it?" Fury set down his tablet and focused on Ezekiel as he asked, "What else have you changed?" "A lot, but stuff you don't know about. I'm honestly pretty sure you know about all of it. At least I think you do," Ezekiel said as he rubbed his chin in thought. "Just send me a list." Ezekiel typed on his tablet and pulled up all the projects he either completed or was still working on before he shot it to Fury. Fury started to look through it before he paused and opened a file and froze. His right eye started to twitch before he looked up at Ezekiel and said, "You split up Banner and the Hulk? Weird, I thought you knew about that. Didn't you see me with Hulk a few times? I thought that was Banner and you were helping him control his powers. He didn't even want to try. So Tao and Agatha helped me split up him and Hulk into separate bodies," Ezekiel said with a shrug before he added, "But Banner and his wife Betty now work for me at Revival and help out in the medical facility, sometimes with research." Fury nodded as he kept reading before he asked in an incredulous tone, "Wait, you're terraforming Mars too? Already 50% done and working on flora and fauna seeding. We are also handcrafting parts of the environment to make it completely unique. Did you watch the wedding for Anna and Happy? That was held on Mars at one of the places we created." Fury pinched the bridge of his nose as he asked, "Do you have any idea what kind of issues this will cause among the world powers if that information gets out? What can they even do? Only Wakanda has the technology to send people to Mars, and they are too concerned with hiding. Sure, maybe if the WSC pooled resources they could make something within a year or two, but even then, so what? What if they place sanctions on Vibe and Revival? They could ruin your Earth-based businesses," Maria said as she glanced over the data Fury shared with her and Coulson. "It wasn't me," Ezekiel said before everyone looked up at him, and he smirked and added, "How can they prove I have anything to do with Mars being terraformed? The wedding video you posted showing off Mars?" Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "That just proves I was there, but nothing else. Plus, I could easily spin the narrative and say some powerful meta-human is doing it alone. Then post a fake documentary about it on Vibe to back it up." Fury nodded his head slightly as he said, "With your current reach, that would easily work. Since you freed Hela, does that mean Thor won't be coming to Earth?" Coulson asked as he looked at the information on his tablet. "No clue. There's a possibility he might show up like in the original timeline, or he might not. I'm basically blind when it comes to the Asgardians, just like they're blind to the things I'm doing on Earth and Mars." Ezekiel leaned back in his chair before he added, "Even though I don't have surveillance on Asgard, there is still a good chance Thor will show up to check if Hela is here. Well, if Odin told him about her, that is." Coulson nodded slightly before Fury asked, "When is Tony going to come out as Iron Man, or is he planning to?" "After he builds up enough hype. That's the only reason you even have those videos. Tony's been letting people see him." Fury shook his head as he said, "I figured he was doing something stupid. He just can't help himself and needs to be the center of attention. His goal is to be the most popular Vibe user." "That's childish," Maria said as Coulson nodded in agreement. "So his appearances in the suit are going to become more frequent?" Fury asked as he continued down the list. "Yeah, he's also looking for opportunities to show off and help people. I would expect the next time there is a natural disaster or something similar, he will show up to help." Ezekiel stored his tablet away as he said, "So was that it? If so, I have other things I need to do." Fury looked up at Ezekiel as he said, "Can you at least keep me and everyone else in the loop going forward? I don't like surprises." "Sure, but it will most likely be after it's already done. So don't complain about it after the fact," Ezekiel said as he stood up. "I already figured as much." Ezekiel waved as he walked out of the door and said, "See you next time." After Ezekiel left, the room was completely silent for over a minute as everyone looked over the list Ezekiel gave them. Maria placed her tablet down first and let out a sigh before she asked, "What's the point of the council he set up if he's doing all of this and not informing everyone else about it?" Because the council was set up more as a peace offering to people like me, Steve, and Peggy. Sure, it gives us some power, and he's followed the direction everyone votes on. But he's also stacked the council with people who are more willing to follow his lead. Maria frowned slightly as she asked, "Then doesn't that make the whole thing pointless?" Coulson nodded in agreement as he gestured towards his own tablet as he said, "Especially when he is doing a lot of this stuff that could be considered council issues. Like the private prison reforms he implemented in the U.S. prisons he bought. I don't think we were even aware of it. At least I wasn't. Neither was I. But even if it was brought up at a council meeting, I'm sure it would have passed a vote." Maria said as she shook her head slightly. "Exactly. Which is why Ezekiel just does what he wants most of the time. Calling the council would just be a waste of time for a pointless vote." Fury said with a sigh before he added, "While I don't like being kept in the dark, I also can't find anything he's done that I'm actually against." "Me either," Maria said as Coulson nodded in agreement. Fury started typing on his tablet as he said, "I'm sending a copy of this to Peggy, so she also knows. But besides being kept in the dark, I doubt she will be upset about all this stuff." As Fury and the others continued going over the list Ezekiel gave them, Ezekiel stopped by to visit Gabby since he knew she would complain if he didn't. As he was hanging out with Gabby, Leech, and some other people, his phone went off with a unique ringtone and Ezekiel quickly picked it up and said, "I honestly didn't expect you to call me." "Neither did I." Ezekiel waited for over half a minute for the other person to continue, but both of them were interrupted when Gabby yelled out, "Hey, it's your turn." "Oh, you're on the phone? Is it Hela? Can I talk to her?" Gabby asked as she reached for the phone when she came closer. Ezekiel smirked as he handed off the phone and said, "It's not Hela, it's someone else." As Ezekiel went over to pick up his bowling ball, Gabby put the phone to her ear and said, "Hi, this is Gabby. Who are you?" An arrogant and slightly annoyed voice asked, "I'm Victor Von Doom. Where's Ezekiel?" "He's bowling, it's his turn." "So how do you know Ezekiel? Are you a new friend? Will you be coming to board game night this week?" Gabby asked rapid-fire questions before Doom could even respond. "Quiet girl. Let me talk to Ezekiel." "You don't have to be a jerk if you don't want to talk," Gabby said with a huff before she handed the phone back to Ezekiel on speaker and added, "He's rude and sounds like a grumpy old man." "I'm not old." Ezekiel chuckled as switched the phone off speaker and asked, "How the hell did you upset Gabby?" "I told her to be quiet." "And why did you let me talk to a literal child?" "It was my turn to bowl. Also, Gabby is a teenager, and as for why, Gabby is a people person and likes to make friends," Ezekiel said as he watched Gabby happily chatting with Leech and the others while Ava took her turn. "So you gonna tell me why you called, or do I need to guess?" Doom was quiet for a little while longer before he said, "I've studied all the books my mother left me. I now know the very basics of the mystic arts, but it's not enough. I'll send you the address of a place in New York City where you can learn more and even line up a teacher for you." Doom doesn't need a teacher. I'm sure you don't. But I happen to be friends with two of the strongest magic users on the planet who each have centuries of experience. Are you sure you wouldn't want one of them to help guide you?" Ezekiel said with a slight smile as he watched Gabby dance after she landed a strike. "Centuries. One of them is almost 1,000 years old, and the other is close to 17,000 years old. And both of them are incredibly powerful." Doom is quiet for a few moments before he said, "I won't refuse if one of them wishes to instruct me."